The small fishing village of Geiranger lay silent beneath a blanket of early spring mist. Wooden houses with grass-covered roofs leaned toward the fjord, their reflections trembling upon the dark water. The air was sharp, carrying the faint salt of the sea mixed with the cool breath of melting snow from the surrounding mountains. Erik Halvorsen walked the narrow pier with steady steps, his boots leaving a muted rhythm upon the planks. He was used to this silence, this waiting before dawn. His family had been fishermen for generations, and the sea was both a friend and a relentless judge. Tonight, however, the quiet felt uneasy. The fjord lay too still, as though holding its breath. Inside his chest, Erik carried a restlessness he could not name. He paused at the edge of the water, staring across the dark glass of the fjord. The mountains rose like giants on either side, their peaks hidden behind a veil of fog. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a faint rumble that did not belong to the sea. He turned his head, listening harder, but the night answered with silence. The village lights flickered weakly, a handful of lanterns glowing in the mist. Most of the villagers had long since gone to bed. Only the occasional creak of timber or the groan of ropes swaying with the tide broke the hush. Erik breathed in, cold air burning his lungs, and tried to shake off the unease. He walked back toward his family's house at the edge of the village, its windows glowing warmly against the damp darkness. Inside, his younger sister, Ingrid, had already gone to sleep. Their father's chair stood empty by the fire. Erik placed a hand on the back of that chair, remembering his father's voice warning that the mountains carried secrets. Snow and stone could betray, without warning. A sharp gust rattled the shutters. Erik turned quickly, heart thumping. Outside, the mist shifted as if disturbed by something heavy, unseen. For an instant, he thought the mountain was whispering. He pushed the thought away, telling himself he was simply tired. Yet as he climbed the stairs to his room, he could not ignore the feeling that the silence of the fjord was not peace at all. It was a silence waiting to be broken. The night deepened over Geiranger, and the village seemed to sleep in perfect stillness. Erik lay in his narrow bed beneath the sloping roof, staring at the wooden beams above him. The restlessness from earlier refused to leave. His ears strained against the silence, waiting, searching for the sound he thought he had imagined. At last it came. A low growl in the distance, as if the mountain itself were shifting its weight. Erik sat up, heart quickening. He crossed to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The fjord remained dark and calm, but above the water, the looming cliffs stood like shadows against the sky. Somewhere in those cliffs, something moved. The sound rose again, louder this time, a hollow crack echoing across the valley. Erik pressed his hand against the cold glass. Snow, loosened by sudden thaw, shifted down the slope in a pale streak. Then another. The mountain exhaled, and the sound carried like thunder. He rushed downstairs, careful not to wake Ingrid. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his boots as he walked toward the harbor. He was not alone. A lantern flared ahead, held by old Lars, the village watchman. The man's beard caught the glow, and his eyes widened as another crack tore through the night. "Did you hear that?" Lars muttered, though the answer was obvious. Erik nodded, his jaw tight. The rumble was growing, a deep, rolling roar now, pulsing through the fjord like a heartbeat. Lights began to appear in the windows of the houses as villagers stirred. Doors opened, voices whispered anxiously. And then, silence. The sound stopped so suddenly it made Erik's stomach twist. The mountains loomed black, and still once more. For a moment it felt as if nothing had happened at all. Yet Erik's instincts told him the silence was not safety. It was only the pause before something far worse. He turned toward Lars, ready to speak, but in that moment, a sharp crack split the air again. High on the cliffs, a wall of snow and ice shifted, breaking free from the mountain's grip. It began to slide downward, slow at first, then with terrible speed. Erik's throat tightened. He understood what was coming. The fjord, so calm only moments ago, was about to be transformed. The night broke apart with a sound like the mountain tearing open. Snow, rock, and ice thundered down the slope, striking the fjord with such force that the earth itself seemed to shudder. Eric gripped the railing at the harbor, his knuckles white, as a great wave surged outward from the impact. Villagers cried out, lanterns swinging wildly in trembling hands. Dogs barked, chains rattled, doors slammed as people scrambled to higher ground. The roar of water filled the air, relentless and merciless. "Get back," Lars shouted, his voice almost lost against the thunder. Eric's eyes darted toward the houses closest to the shoreline. One of them, a small timber house with smoke still curling from the chimney, was Ingrid's friend Solveig's home. He saw light flickering frantically inside, shadows rushing against the window. The water was already racing towards it. Without thinking, Eric ran. He pushed past Lars, his boots pounding the sodden earth. The first wave crashed against the pier, splintering wood and sending a spray of freezing water into the night. Eric leapt aside, narrowly avoiding the collapsing timbers. The house door burst open just as Eric reached it. Solveig's mother stumbled out, clutching a bundle of blankets. A child's cry pierced the air from inside. Eric did not hesitate. He forced his way through the doorway, the air thick with panic and smoke from the fire that had been left unattended. Inside, Solveig stood frozen, her small hands pressed against her ears, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eric scooped her up in one arm, the child's weight light but trembling. He turned, shouting at Solveig's mother to follow. Together they pushed through the crashing spray, fighting to stay upright as the water clawed at their legs. They reached higher ground, gasping, soaked to the bone. Behind them, the fjord devoured the lower houses, swallowing wood and stone alike. The village of Geiranger had awakened into a nightmare. The villagers gathered on the hillside, shivering in the mist and chaos. Faces pale, voices urgent, eyes wide with fear. They watched as the waves tore through the harbor, ripping boats from their moorings and smashing them against the rocks. Eric stood among them, Solveig clinging to his side. He scanned the crowd, searching for Ingrid. Relief washed over him when he saw her small figure wrapped in a blanket, led by their neighbor, Marta. Ingrid's eyes found his, and she rushed into his arms. The roar of the water faded into a sinister calm. The fjord lay unsettled, dark ripples spreading across its surface. Yet the silence felt worse than the noise. It was the silence of something unfinished. Old Lars raised his lantern, the flame trembling in the wind. "The mountain is not done," he muttered. His words hung heavy in the cold air. The villagers knew the truth. Landslides rarely came only once. A cry went up from the far end of the gathering. A man shouted that his brother's family was still missing, their house too close to the shore. Another woman wailed for her husband, last seen near the boats. The hillside erupted into voices, desperate and fearful. Eric clenched his fists. He could not bear to stand idle while others suffered. He looked down toward the fjord. The mist shifted, revealing jagged ruins of houses, roofs half submerged, walls collapsing with each swell. Somewhere among that wreckage, people might still be alive. "Stay here," Eric told Ingrid, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Stay with Marta. I will come back." Ingrid's eyes widened, but she nodded, her lips pressed tight. Eric turned toward the ruins, each step carrying him closer to the heart of danger. He knew it was madness, but he also knew that hesitation meant death for those still trapped. The fjord was not finished, and neither was he. Eric descended toward the ruined houses, the air thick with smoke, salt, and the sharp tang of splintered wood. The ground was slick with mud, each step a battle against the pull of the fjord. Lantern light flickered above him on the hillside, the villagers watching his descent in tense silence. The wreckage groaned like a wounded beast. A broken beam shifted, releasing a cascade of icy water that nearly swept him off his feet. He steadied himself, forcing breath into his lungs. Somewhere nearby, he thought he heard a voice. "Help!" The cry was faint, muffled beneath the ruins. Eric pushed toward the sound, tearing aside planks with his bare hands. Splinters pierced his skin, but he barely felt them. At last he uncovered a pocket of air beneath a collapsed roof. Inside, a boy huddled, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Take my hand," Eric urged. The boy reached out, trembling. Eric pulled him free, wrapping an arm around him just as another wave surged against the ruins. They stumbled, nearly dragged under, but Eric fought against the water with every ounce of strength. He reached higher ground, the boy clinging to him. The villagers cheered faintly, but their voices were quickly silenced by a new sound. A distant, echoing crack, deeper than before. The mountain was stirring again. A rumble rolled across the fjord, heavier, deeper, and closer. The ground trembled beneath Eric's boots. The boy clung to him, sobbing. He turned, eyes wide, to the mountainside looming above. A section of the cliff face sheared away, stone and snow tearing free in a violent cascade. The air filled with the sound of shattering rock. The second collapse was larger, fiercer, unstoppable. "Run!" someone shouted from the hillside. Eric's body moved before thought. He scooped the boy into his arms and sprinted upward, his lungs burning, his legs straining against the pull of mud and water. Behind him, the fjord roared as another wave built, higher, more furious than the first. He reached the hillside just as the wave struck. The ground shook with the force, a wall of water crashing through what little remained of the harbor. Boats, houses, even stone walls were torn away, carried like driftwood into the black depths. The villagers huddled together, their eyes wide with horror. Children cried, women whispered prayers, men stood frozen in despair. Eric set the boy down, gasping for breath, and turned to face the devastation. The fjord was no longer a place of calm. It had become a monster, awakened and hungry. The survivors gathered on the hillside, their numbers diminished, their voices hushed. The air smelled of fear, sharp and unrelenting. Every face was pale, every gaze fixed on the dark water below. Eric's sister clung to his arm. "Will it stop?" she whispered. He had no answer. The mountain groaned still, restless. The fjord shifted uneasily, as though waiting for its next command. Old Lars raised his lantern once more, the light trembling. "We must move higher," he said. "The mountain will not sleep tonight." The villagers obeyed, climbing the narrow path toward the old church that stood on the ridge. Its white walls gleamed faintly in the mist, a fragile beacon above the darkness. They filed inside, filling the wooden pews with whispers and trembling breaths. Eric stood near the door, watching the fjord below. He could not shake the image of houses crushed, lives lost in the black water. Yet amidst the fear, he felt something else growing within him. A determination, fierce and unyielding. The mountain might take their homes, but it would not take everyone. Not if he could help it. The church walls trembled with each distant rumble. The villagers prayed, voices rising and falling like the wind. Eric stood apart, his eyes on the fjord. He could not rest. Then, faintly, he heard it. A cry carried on the wind. Not the echo of a villager, not the groan of wood or stone. A child's voice, desperate and thin. Eric's chest tightened. He stepped outside, straining his ears. The cry came again, sharper this time, from the direction of the ruined houses. Against reason, against fear, he knew he had to go. "Ingrid, stay here," he told his sister firmly. "Do not move until I return." Before anyone could stop him, he ran into the night, down the slippery path, past shattered beams and swirling mist, toward the sound that called to him. His heart pounded, each beat echoing the mountain's growl. At last, he reached a half-collapsed house near the water's edge. The cry came from within, weak but steady. He forced his way inside, pushing past broken beams and sodden furniture. There in the corner stood a small figure. A boy no older than 8, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with terror. The walls around him trembled with each distant rumble. "Come," Eric whispered, reaching out his hand. The boy hesitated, then took it. At that moment, Another crack split the night. The mountain roared once more. Eric pulled the boy into his arms and staggered back through the wreckage. The fjord rumbled louder, waves building in the darkness. The air vibrated with the force of the mountain's fury. He ran, each step a battle against the mud and spray. Behind him, the ruined house groaned and collapsed, swallowed by the water. Ahead, the hillside rose steeply, the church lights flickering like stars above. The boy clung to him, shivering violently. Eric gritted his teeth, lungs burning, heart pounding. He would not let go. He would not surrender. A roar split the air, louder than before. The third collapse thundered down the cliffs, shaking the ground. A massive wall of snow and rock plunged into the fjord, sending the largest wave yet surging outward. Eric pushed harder, his muscles screaming. He could see the faces of the villagers at the church, lanterns raised, arms outstretched. He climbed higher and higher, the roar of the wave chasing him like a beast. The church bell clanged once, struck by the trembling earth. Its sound echoed across the valley, a cry against the darkness. Eric reached the ridge just as the waves struck below. The fjord exploded in white spray, devouring the last of the village. The roar filled the valley, shaking the mountains, drowning every other sound. He collapsed on the ground, the boy still in his arms, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Around him, the villagers clung to one another, their eyes wide with awe and terror. The church stood firm, its walls trembling but unbroken. Slowly, the roar faded. The waves subsided, leaving only ruin in their wake. The fjord lay scarred and restless, but the ridge had held. The survivors were safe. Eric looked toward the east. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting a pale glow upon the mist. The night of terror was over, yet the memory of it would live in every soul that had endured. In his arms, the boy stirred and whispered a single word of thanks. Eric closed his eyes, holding him tightly, as the light of morning finally broke across Sky Ranger.